Hello and welcome to the programme which brings together BBC specialists and the foreign correspondents who write, blog and broadcast to audiences back home from the Dateline London. 2 weeks in, what do Russians know about the war that, in their country, dare not speak its name? Europe begins to wean itself from Russian energy, but is it fast enough? And as shortages bite, Ukrainians restrict exports of wheat. But what of those in the Middle East who depend on it? Joining us this week, Henry Chu, an experienced foreign correspondent at the LA Times, who, as the US West Coast sleeps, is ensuring its readers are kept up to date on what's happening in Ukraine. Vera Krichevskaya is a documentary filmmaker. She helped to found TV Rain, an independent channel in Russia, which has now been shut down. And joining me in the studio, Gabriel Gatehouse, international editor for BBC Television's Newsnight programme. Good to have you with us. Good to have you two with us as well. Thank you very much. And to Vera for joining us for the first time on this programme. Vera, I'd like to start with you, if I may. How are Russians finding out about what the Kremlin calls its special military operation?
Good evening. Can I start with the latest news? In 1 hour and 30 minutes, Instagram in Russia will be officially banned. Before on this week, Twitter and Facebook was banned. But all this started 2 weeks ago, on the first day of the war. New law was imposed that restricted to say word war and to call it this war as a special operation. And another law was imposed saying you cannot quote any source regarding the war except the official sources of the Russian Ministry of Defense or Russian news state media. How it started 2 weeks ago.
And is there a way that Russians can get around this? Are they finding ways to get information?
Situation was changed several times. First week of the war, TV Rain and other independent media could work during first 7 days, even more, maybe 8 days. It was a kind of verbal game. For example, TV Rain, TV Dozhd gave voices for many Ukrainians, many Ukrainian experts participated broadcasting. But later, new amendments were added, and any fake information regarding the war became punishable with 15 years in prison
and
for any reporter.
And of course, the authorities decide what is and isn't fake. Henry, the sanctions are clearly having an impact. That's one thing. But isn't there a risk in, for example, some of the social media companies have themselves withdrawn, have closed access to their sites in Russia? There's a danger that actually winning hearts and minds isn't happening. Is there enough of an effort to do that?
Well, it is a difficult challenge because to win hearts and minds, you need access to eyes and ears. And as Vera was just saying, those avenues of information for Russians that aren't from states' sources are becoming fewer and fewer. You know, it's not anymore a war where NATO, for example, is directly flying over Russian airspace and can drop leaflets on the people as we thought about war as back before. It's much more electronic now. And when you have a population in Russia where the majority of people still rely on television, and if you on the outside don't have access to those airwaves, then trying to actually get information over to them and to win them over is going to be a really tough task. As Vera said, social media too are being shut down. Facebook, Instagram and Twitter. In fact, the parent company of Facebook and Instagram is Meta, is being designated an extremist organization. And then we also need to remember that even those Russians, younger ones by and large, who are getting information through online sources and through social media, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're getting Western information. It could also be from Russian sources themselves and from other pro-Russian outlets. So finding that way in is really difficult. I think that perhaps some of the most effective appeals to hearts and minds has actually come from Ukraine's own president, Volodymyr Zelensky, who speaks Russian and has made direct appeals to the Russian people in their own language to say, this is not your war. Why are your leaders doing this? And encouraging them to protest against that. But again, if there are no avenues in, then it's going to be very difficult to try to win those hearts and minds you talked about,
But I
Sean.
suppose there are informal connections, aren't there? Because so many Ukrainians have Russian relatives and vice versa.
Vast numbers. I've been speaking to people in eastern Ukraine, especially where most people have Russian as a first language, who say they've been talking to their relatives inside Russia. But often you hear these heartbreaking tales of people saying, guys, you guys are bombing us here. What are you doing? And their relatives on the other side of the divide going, we don't believe you. This is propaganda. These are the Ukrainians doing this to yourself. So you have these heart-rending situations where families are being driven apart not just by war and bombs, but emotionally and by no longer sharing a shared truth. I just want to pick up on what Henry was saying about social media and winning hearts and minds. I mean, Meta, Facebook's parent company, yesterday, I think, took the extraordinary decision that it would suspend its prohibition on calls for violence against Russians. Now, okay, they've been blocked in Russia, so maybe this is just a business decision. Yeah. But talking about how not to win hearts and minds, right? It's an incredible decision.
That does sound bizarre. I'd be interested to hear what the company's explanation is for that. I suppose the group of people who might have access to information are the people around President Putin. Have you detected in the conversations and the contacts you have in Russia any sense of unease within the regime?
I would be very interested to know to what extent the greater Kremlin, the tight circle around Putin, actually believes this Orwellian propaganda that they're putting out, or to what extent...
numbers are we talking about? Is it a couple of dozen, 100? Is it?
I would say more in the region of a couple of dozen. I mean, This is in flux, but it's shrinking, right? So I always used to think of Putin's power as resting on a three-legged stool. So you had the oligarchs, the money men, the technocrats, people like Sergei Lavrov, who are basically career politicians, make the system run, but essentially do what they're told, while getting quite rich at the same time. And then there were the siloviki, the strongmen, right? The people from the security apparatus and all of that. And I always thought of Putin's power resting on those three legs. But I think what we've come to realize in the last 2 weeks, 2.5 weeks, is that the influence of those two first groups, the oligarchs and the apparatchiks, has lessened. And the influence of the strongmen is much stronger. So really the key question is, what are they thinking? Right. And I don't know what you think, Vera, but I don't think anyone really knows.
Vera?
First of all, I would like to say that the state, the regime created years ago in 2014, they created non-existent world for audience, for Russian viewers, and then believed in this non-existent world. I think they started believing of their own propaganda. That's what happened. Otherwise, you cannot explain to anyone this invasion. It is the first thing. The second thing is, I think it's clear already that Putin got very extremely non-professional reports. We got a leak from different sources today that one general, FSB general, and his deputy was put on home arrest today.
House arrest, yes.
House arrest today. And this particular general reported about what is going on in Ukraine. So it looks like the Kremlin started understanding that they knew nothing about what is going on in Ukraine, really.
Got you. Henry, President Biden on Friday again returned to the question of sanctions. President Putin had said on Thursday, first address I think he's made on this subject publicly, yes, some things are going to hurt, but we're going to mitigate the effects. Biden's moved fast. Is there any frustration that the pace with which the Europeans and the British are moving, because they are manifestly moving at a slower pace in terms of banning oil and gas imports?
I I think on the fuel question, you're right that there is a two-speed effort going on. On some of the previous ones, though, in terms of sanctioning actual people, for example, the lawmakers in the Duma who voted for in favor of this of recognizing the breakaway republics, on different oligarchs, and some of the other sanctions that have been applied, I think there was much more unanimity and a bit more synchronicity in terms of when they actually impose these sanctions. And actually, although Biden, did announce this ban on oil and gas imports from Russia, and then on some products, perhaps putting more tariffs on them by revoking this most favored nation trading status, I think there's some sympathy in Washington that Europe, of course, is in a very different situation from the U.S. when it comes to reliance on Russian fuel and Russian products. You look at what the U.S. imports in terms of barrels of oil from Russia, it's only about 700,000 a day, whereas for Europe, it's 4 million. And then you also have some European countries that are almost 100% reliant on Russian gas. So to tell their people that now you need to freeze or actually be paying through the roof for home heating and home cooking is going to be very difficult. So I think there is some compassion there within Washington as to Europe trying to go a little bit slower, and also recognizing that, for example, you have Chancellor Olaf Scholz in Germany already taking that step of suspending the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which the Biden administration had wanted for a long time, and now they actually have done.
The figures, Gabriel, are dramatic, aren't they? I mean, 60% of Russia's oil exports go to Europe. Only 2% of that is to UK, the rest to the EU, but 8% to US. Yeah. I mean, Europe is absolutely exposed on this.
I was thinking when this first started, in the first week, few days, everyone was so shocked by what happened, and then suddenly everyone came together. I mean, the response was quite incredible. The sort of Europe, which we think of as being sort of congenitally disunited, really came together on this. And I was thinking in those days, and I was talking to people inside Russia in Moscow and trying to figure out what was going on inside the Kremlin, and would anyone turn against Putin if the consequences, economic consequences, lifestyle consequences for these people seemed dire enough? And there was a moment I wondered whether, if in those early days when they were piling on the pressure day by day and it was getting bigger and bigger, Europe had said, you know what, we're not going to buy your gas. Don't care what it costs. We'll print money. We'll do whatever it, I wondered at that point whether there might have been a palace coup, whether some of the people around him who've been around him for 15, 20 years, who've got very rich, while sort of ranting and railing against the West at home, but, going to their...
This is Russia's export, isn't it? It doesn't really have much else of
scale. The whole
scale.
regime runs on oil and gas. That is their lifeblood. That is what gives them power. That is what gives them wealth. So I wondered whether some of those people who, rail against the West at home, but, go on holidays in their nice fancy yachts and stay in their villas in Tuscany and send their kids to British boarding schools, whether if there'd been the energy thing, if Europe had said, do you know what, we're not buying your gas anymore, whether somebody would have moved against him. It's speculation, but I think maybe that window has passed now.
That was an opportunity. Vera, clearly one side effect of the kind of surge in oil prices that actually it means Russia gets a bit more for what it does sell, the 20% to China and all the rest of it. But do you get the impression from talking to friends in Russia that the sanctions are yet hitting ordinary Russians? Are they yet feeling the effects of this?
No, they're panicking. There is a panic in Moscow and St. Petersburg. Average people, because prices for food, for very simple food basket, meat, sugar, grains, are going up every day. And people try to buy something in advance. And it's already shortage on shelves at supermarkets. People are panicking, and there is a problem with the banking system as well. So I think it hurts the average people from the beginning, from the second day, I would say.
About you, Vera, but my friends in Moscow, many of whom are journalists and many of whom have now been forced to flee because, as you said, journalism has effectively become a crime punishable by 15 years in jail. They now find themselves in the position whereby I've got a friend who's just left. His Visa cards don't work because of British sanctions. He can't get any of his money out of his bank account in Russia
Yeah.
because of Russian counter sanctions. Some of these sanctions are hurting the wrong people.
Yes. I mean, that's the
Absolutely,
paradox, isn't it?
absolutely. Most of my colleagues found themselves on Tuesday morning without money.
They've
In
no money and they
Georgia-
can't work.
Yeah, in Georgia, in Istanbul, no money. Cards stop working. It's a disaster for them.
Henry, when we're talking about kind of unintended consequences, we've been here before, haven't we, where exports of oil have not been made available by countries as a punishment. This is us choosing to, in a sense, punish ourselves for a good cause. But it's possible Russia may retaliate by making it harder to get some of the gas and oil. Remind us what impact that had on the world economy in the aftermath of the Yom Kippur War, as we call it, in '73, when Arab countries punished those who had supported Israel.
Yeah, well, so that was what some people call the first oil shock that the world had experienced up to that point. And it meant that the U.S., for example, was under embargo with oil from the Middle East. And I think oil prices went up by about fourfold per barrel during that time. And so it was really felt, certainly in the U.S. and other parts of the world where there was rationing. There was really quite an uproar in the U.S. Over this, and President Nixon at the time was really grasping at different ways to try to get oil into the country and make sure that it wasn't going to lead to his own downfall from that reason. And what it had, though, as a more long-term effect on the U.S. was a sort of a clearing of the mind and the realization that the U.S. needed to develop different energy sources, that it couldn't only rely on the Middle East any longer, that it needed to increase domestic production, it needed to increase efficiency. And so it led to a real soul searching when it came to energy policy. And then what you have now is a really interesting turn of the wheel of history, because what happened within a few years is that the Soviet Union then actually became the world's largest oil producer. They started doing a lot more production and exploration in Siberia. And so that ended up diversifying the overall supply so that there wasn't this kind of reliance on the Middle East. And now what do we see with the U.S. saying that it's going to ban Russian oil? This Biden administration is actually talking about getting more oil from where? The Middle East, Saudi Arabia. So
or
what goes
indeed
around
Ukraine.
comes around very strangely.
What am I saying? Or indeed Venezuela. I mean, I saw some comments from Nicolas Maduro, the president of Venezuela, who is kind of almost public enemy number one in Washington, saying that he'd had a very respectful and cordial meeting with an American delegation last Sunday, talking about exactly this, accessing some Venezuelan oil.
Yeah, absolutely. Energy shocks make for interesting bedfellows.
Gabriel, you know Ukraine incredibly well. You've lived there for some years. You're back forwards regularly. You've got lots of friends there. It's a vast country. You showed me some of it when I visited for work and worked with you. A vast, beautiful country, agriculturally so rich. And yet last weekend they were imposing export controls, not just on wheat, but things as basic as poultry and eggs. And almost everybody's got poultry around the country in such a rural, and the country has such big rural areas. Does that suggest that they're really now starting to get seriously worried about food supplies for Ukraine?
I think they're seriously worried about everything. I mean, I think for the moment, the sense I'm getting from Ukrainians I'm speaking to is that they're fighting for their lives, right? Yeah. But cities like Mariupol are encircled. People are melting snow to drink. Yeah. So I think the sort of the slightly longer term, you can see them putting in these policies, which will be kind of governmental thinking, thinking for the long term. But I think your average person is thinking, where do I run to? How can I live once I've run there, and what are our prospects for kind of maintaining independence? And those are the ones who kind of have the ability to move. The other ones in these surrounded cities, they are facing the prospect of potentially very long sieges, encirclement.
Potentially starvation conditions, right, because outside humanitarian supplies are not getting in.
And if we see that the kinds of tactics that Russia and the Syrians used in Syria, we see what the Ukrainians might be looking forward to, and this is a very scary prospect.
Henry, I just wanted to pick up on the consequences of this worldwide, because one of the things I didn't know until this conflict started is how much of a country like Lebanon, and I think Yemen as well, but Lebanon in particular, is dependent on Ukrainian wheat. Now, there's a country that is on its uppers, that is bankrupt, that is struggling to feed its people. And suddenly, Ukrainian wheat, I think Russia and Ukraine together is like 30% of the traded wheat in the world, it's not there, it's not available. I mean, this is a war that could be exported, couldn't it? In terms of instability, Ukraine, Central Europe, but other parts of the world could start to feel that instability as well.
Political instability and also just food insecurity. I think for Lebanon, those of us who remember looking at those incredible photos after the blast in the Beirut port damaged those huge grain silos, well, that's where so much of Lebanon's grain came in. And I think its amount that it had relied on Ukraine for was about 60% of its grain supply. And as you say, it's a completely bankrupt country now and is desperately looking for other sources of grain. And in Egypt as well, which I think is the world's largest wheat importer, that's another country where wheat is incredibly subsidized by the government, and rightfully so for a population that is quite dependent and quite poor on wheat. And so if those prices start going up, which some experts say could be happening already, obviously some prices are already going up, and in July perhaps being felt all the more, well, then you could be exporting political instability to those places. And it's not just within sort of that more close-lying region. Actually, a lot of the wheat goes as far afield as Asia. I think Indonesia has about a quarter of its wheat comes from Ukraine. And there it's processed into instant noodles and snacks and other things that very poor people rely on. So you're right that this could actually be felt all the way out in ripples around the world, to the extent that today, I think the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization said that you could have 13 million more people experiencing food insecurity by next year. And that's just because of what's happening in what's often called the breadbasket of Europe, and certainly perhaps the breadbasket of the world.
Yeah, and I mean, the wheat traded figures in Chicago, the ones that I saw most recently, it's 50% up the cost since the invasion. That's the bulk price. We've got about a minute each for you just at the end before we go. Vera, first, what worries you most about the trajectory of this war, about the way things are going?
I think it might last very long. And I do not believe now in this particular moment that this war might be ended tomorrow or in a week. It doesn't look so. And obviously it's going to be a huge wave of repressions inside Russia as well, and endless amount of deaths.
Henry.
Well, just thinking of those incredible numbers of people escaping the country, I think it's over 2.5 million now. And they say that half of those are children. Women and children are being allowed out. Men of fighting age are told to stay within Ukraine. But what does this do to a country long term? I think already that's about over 1/8 of people under the age of 18 in Ukraine have left. What does that mean demographically for this country in the future? What does it mean about national identity? I mean, this will unfold for years to come.
I've got a couple of minutes left, Gabriel. Do you want to pick up on some of those thoughts?
So I think Henry's right in that this is a catastrophe for Ukraine. But there's a question here. If this is, and Vera touched on this, if this ends up being a short war, and let's hope it is, and that Ukraine comes out of it with its independence more or less intact, Ukraine will end up being a much stronger country than it was when it went in. The corrosive question of Russian speakers versus Ukrainian speakers will have almost entirely been wiped out by this cataclysmic event and this common enemy.
A catalyst for unity.
Right, absolutely. Russia, on the other hand, and Vera is quite right on this, no matter how long this war goes on or how it ends, it's going to get very, very dark in Russia. I think, as Vera says, repressions, the economy that we've talked about, all of this kind of stuff. Until this regime is removed, things are going to get dark. I have no doubt that this war is the beginning of the end for Vladimir Putin. It's a question of how long the end takes to come to fruition. I think, at the end of the day, all wars end in a negotiated settlement. And I think this week we were kind of in a place where it could either be a short war with a negotiated settlement, perhaps something over recognising Crimea and the separatist republics and maybe neutrality for Ukraine, or it could be a long war. And I think we were kind of in that pivot point where we saw talks in Turkey that didn't go terribly well. I think that is being decided right now.
Gabriel Gatehouse, Henry Chu and Vera Kricheskaya, thank you all very much. I look forward, Vera, to welcome you into the studio very soon and to have Henry back in with us as well. Gabriel, love to see you. See you again soon, I hope. That's it from Dateline London. More from us same time next weekend. Goodbye.